This lecture will define what hypotheses are and will identify features of good political science hypotheses. First of all, let's start with the definition. What is a hypothesis? A hypothesis is a statement that explains how the dependent variable of your study and the independent variable or variables are related. So to elaborate this definition a little bit, I think we need to turn to the characteristics of good hypotheses that will explain this a little bit more. So what are these characteristics of good hypotheses? I'm going to preview 4 different characteristics throughout this. First, your hypothesis should be an empirical and not a normative statement. That you are making some sort of claim about how the real world is, not how it should be. So let's talk about a poor hypothesis. It would be one where you said democracy is the best system of government. This is a judgment call. It's not something that I can really provide evidence to test. So I'd have to rephrase this in some way to provide something that I could actually test. So a better hypothesis would be to focus on something that a democracy does better. Democracies, say, have better rates of economic growth than non-democracies. And so this is something where you can draw on objective empirical data, not just value judgments. Our second criteria is that your hypothesis needs to be plausible, that there needs to be some sort of logic to the hypothesis, and you should be identifying some sort of explanation here so that you're specifying the causal mechanism involved. This means that you're going to be identifying relevant intervening variables to explain how X causes Y. You can't just say that X and Y are related, but you have to specify what the logic is. And so when you're writing this out, you might summarize the hypothesis in one sentence, but then you'll follow up with a paragraph or two that explains the logic. So in general, this should be grounded in the academic literature, that there is some reason that you thought X and Y would be related. And so to add credence to your hypothesis, you'll typically want to back it up with a citation or two, and this is the function of your literature review, to show potential mechanisms that could be out there that the literature has come up with. Convince me that you're not simply pulling this out of thin air. So let's talk about a poor hypothesis here. One, it could be that people with large feet are more likely to participate in social movements. Okay, you'd have to tell me a reason why you think that this would be possible. I think it'd be pretty difficult to come up with some sort of justification of why you would have this hypothesis. Maybe you do end up finding some sort of relationship out in the data, but you'd have to convince me that that's not just simply a fluke, right? That there is a reason why you would think that people with big feet will participate. So I'm not going to even change this into a better hypothesis because my answer is come up with a different hypothesis entirely. Our third characteristic is that your hypothesis should be directional, that it should explain the direction of the relationship between X and Y. So don't just say X affects Y. You need to change that and say how X affects Y, in what direction does it affect it? So what kind of change in X will come from a change in Y? So a poor hypothesis would be that exposure to negative campaign ads affects the likelihood that an individual will turn out to vote. Okay, I can buy that. But the problem is you haven't told me if exposure to negative campaign ad makes me more likely to vote or less likely to vote. I could hypothetically think of reasons either way, right? That a negative campaign ad could motivate me to turn out for my guy, or it could make me so cynical about the system. So you have to specify, is it going to make me more or less likely to do something? So a better hypothesis would be that exposure to negative campaign ads decreases the likelihood that an individual would turn out to vote. So here we've added the direction by saying decreases instead of just affects. And our fourth criteria is that our hypothesis must be testable. So there's 2 different versions of this will look like. First, that our hypothesis isn't simply a tautology. So what is a tautology? That's a hypothesis in which the dependent variable and the independent variable are identical. And this makes it impossible to disconfirm. so that it's circular reasoning. A poor hypothesis might be that voters that support President Obama are more likely to approve of President Obama's performance. The problem with this is that supporting Obama and approving of Obama are basically the same thing. There might be a slight difference related to performance, but they're so close that it's not really a hypothesis that we can test. The second version of this criteria that has to be testable is that you have to come up with a hypothesis that could be tested using data that you can actually collect. So a poor hypothesis would be that North Koreans that work white-collar jobs are more likely to approve of Kim Jong-un's performance. Okay, well, I can buy that, right? That maybe it's that people who have white-collar jobs have a better standard of living, and therefore they think that the country is going in the right direction. All right, that's feasible. The problem with this potentially interesting idea is that North Korea is a totalitarian state. You can't collect public opinion data. Data doesn't exist, and you wouldn't be able to go in and do a survey of white-collar workers. So this isn't meaning that it's a bad hypothesis in theory. It's more that in practice it could never actually be tested.